I just wanted to start on the tragic stabbing attack that we saw in Glasgow. Now, the man who was shot dead by police, we know, was a 28-year-old asylum seeker who came to the United Kingdom 6 months ago, who'd been staying in a hotel with around 100 other asylum seekers rather than a flat as usual. What lessons should we learn from the attack?
Well, I think, first of all, Sophie, there's very limited information that I can share because there's an ongoing investigation. But I think, first and foremost, I want to pay tribute to the police and to the emergency workers, the first responders, in the way in which they handled what happened, the incident. And obviously, there are individuals that have been injured. We have a police officer as well who was injured. So my thoughts are with them, and they've been outstanding, absolutely first class. We have to remember as well, though, specifically when it comes to asylum seeker and accommodation has been allocated in this particular way because of the COVID-19 crisis. So, of course, we constantly review the methods around asylum, the accommodation, the provision, the support, all of which is in line with law. So back down to the Immigration and Asylum Act from 1999. We follow all the legislative guidance, the principles. We work with Public Health England. We work with local authorities. Obviously, we have to work within a legal framework, and everything that we do in terms of asylum accommodation, housing and support is within that framework.
OK, now moving on to COVID-19 and the economic hits in particular, because we're learning from the papers this morning that the Prime Minister is going to be setting out on Tuesday, if you like, a plan to build our way back to health after coronavirus. What is the idea?
Well, it's an important plan. We are absolutely keen. We've been clear from day one, effectively, that, once we've moved past the peak of the virus, it was our objective to get society reopened again and to get Britain moving again. And as you've seen from what's been trailed in some of the newspapers today, this is an ambitious government, a government that wants to level up, a government that wants to bring social justice, greater economic opportunity, better support for the entire country and across the country. This is in line with our manifesto commitments, many of the points that we made during the general election, Sophie, which was only 6 months ago. So as we move out of this awful period of coronavirus, this dreadful disease, we want to get Britain moving again. We're building now very much a road to recovery, a roadmap, focusing on infrastructure right now, levelling up across the country, focused on roads, broadband, the type of things that effectively help to create jobs, but also provide services and growth, economic growth and opportunity around the country.
Yeah, things have certainly changed since that general election that you mentioned there. Just before your interview, we spoke to Mark Drakeford, the First Minister of Wales, who was talking about his concerns about this government's messaging, effectively saying that it was too positive, saying things are going to get back to normal, when actually there's still such a high prevalence of the virus among us. Now, I know, of course, that you'll be keen to give good news, but he's got a point, hasn't he? Isn't it a bit early to talk about the country bouncing forward, as Boris Johnson does in the Mail on Sunday, when people are still dying of coronavirus, when the infection rate isn't falling as quickly as we hope, and when millions of children are still out of school?
Well, absolutely not. The government outlined in May, in fact, the Prime Minister outlined effectively a roadmap to reopening our country, reopening society, getting children back to school, getting people back to work. But we have to remember, Sophie, all of this is within a framework. This isn't an overnight announcement that things are going to switch back to normal tomorrow. We have planned this in terms of a roadmap over a period of time. We've been working with businesses in terms of engaging with them on the right type of guidance in terms of how we reopen society, whether it's the hospitality sector, whether it's key industries, how we support businesses in getting their staff back to work. You've been part of many of the discussions. You've interviewed people on your programme before about even public transport, people using public transport. There is a combined and a coherent approach that this government has taken. And I think it applies across the 4 nations, the whole of the United Kingdom. It is true that we are all at different stages of this virus. This virus has not gone away. We don't have a vaccine. We are seeing heroic efforts internationally, led by our country as well, in terms of putting resources in to find a vaccine. But we are living with this virus. And because that's the situation, we have to work within the scientific advice, the guidance. We have to be very conscientious about public health. We want to control the spread of this virus, we are working to support industry, working to support the private sector as well as the public sector to get people back to work and to get our economy moving. That is absolutely the right thing to do. And on top of that, it's fair to say we've spent over £100 billion in supporting the economy over the last 13 weeks through what has been a very, very difficult and challenging economic period.
You give the impression that this is a roadmap that the government's been following, a perfect plan, if you like, where everything has happened at exactly the time that it should. But if you just look at some of the individual policies, it's hard to escape the view that things have been changing pretty quickly. I mean, air bridges, for example, something that we're expecting to hear more about whether or not there'll be countries that the UK can link up with to escape this 2-week quarantine when you get back to the United Kingdom. We didn't do that in the beginning, when other countries were, when we had a relatively low infection rate. And now, once it's been introduced, 3 weeks later, we're changing it.
No, well, the point is, Sophie, you've just made my point for me. All policies have been under review. We work with the science. We don't follow religiously what other countries are doing around the world. Every single country is at a different stage of this virus. We're affected at a different time compared to other European countries. We respond based on many of our review periods, which were outlined in the roadmap that the Prime Minister outlined back in May. We've said with regards to every policy that they're always under review. That is absolutely the right approach and the responsible approach that all governments, any government, should be taking.
OK,
and
so
with regards to public health...
On air bridges specifically,
I was just about to come on to that.
Yeah. Thank you. I was just going to ask where the countries will be that we're going to have air bridges with from July.
Well, first of all, with regards to the public health measures at the border, when those measures were brought in, they were brought in to prevent a second wave of the virus being imported in. As we see rates of the virus drop with other countries in the world, and also as we see domestic transmission fall, it's right that we look at how we can facilitate travel and the air corridors or the travel corridors that I and my colleagues have spoken about. In terms of the countries where this will be possible, there'll be an announcement in the next few days ahead. The review point is tomorrow, which is what the government had outlined, what we had said we would do and outlined earlier on in the month. So you'll have to, along with members of the public, listen to the advice, see what the government is saying in terms of the countries that are going to be opening up with, who we're working with, the countries that my colleague, the Transport Secretary, is in dialogue with right now. But of course, these measures won't come in overnight. They will take time because some of this will be down to negotiation, discussions with certain countries. But the principle around sharing data, travel data, the locator form that actually the Home Office has created to capture a lot of this information will absolutely still remain because we have to keep on top of this disease. We need to know where people are moving. This links into track and trace. This links into the testing regime. This links into many of the tools that the government has developed over the last 13 weeks to keep control of this virus.
OK, talking about keeping the virus under control, we've all seen pictures in the last week or so of people gathering in large groups on beaches, in parks, celebrating Liverpool winning the Premier League. Are some people acting irresponsibly? Well, I think it's important that the public realise that this virus has not disappeared at all. I've said this many times. The Prime Minister has, all my colleagues across government, our scientific advisors have made this point too. We're living with the virus. We are still in a health emergency and a health pandemic. Now, of course, as we unlock and reopen society, we're doing that with very clear measures and parameters around social distancing, but also hygiene measures as well. So are people, just specifically on the question, are people acting irresponsibly when you can see them on beaches and so on, when they're not observing social distancing?
People need to follow the guidance that we have put in place, and that's absolutely right.
Are they irresponsible if they don't?
In saying that, the public need to think about other people as well in terms of spreading the virus. They themselves may not know that they could be a carrier of the virus and they could be spreading that within the community and passing that on to other people. I think we all have to take responsibility. We all have to act conscientiously. We have social distancing measures in place for a reason. We've been clear that if you do go out in the public domain, going out is a good thing, but you do that in groups of no more than 6 people. It is really important that we continue to follow this guidance. I cannot think of anything worse than us having another wave of this awful disease that would then result in more lockdowns, local lockdowns, and of course that means we'll be retreating back after the big gains that we have made across the country. We don't want to see that. We want to let people get on back to work. We want children to go to schools. We want society to reopen. But to do that, we have to be responsible, which is why we're working day in, day out with businesses, with the public sector and the private sector, with schools, with the health authorities, with Public Health England, to make sure the guidance is followed, but also social distancing remains.
This week, Boris Johnson warned against people taking too many liberties with the guidance. But when people have seen the Prime Minister's chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, taking liberties with the guidance, isn't it inevitable that they'll think, why should I follow this to the letter?
Well, of course it's not. We've had a tragic number of deaths in our country because of this horrendous disease. And I think that is the most sobering fact about coronavirus, the way in which this disease is indiscriminate. It has no boundaries.
The question was specifically about Dominic Cummings and whether that had an impact on people's reaction to the lockdown guidance.
Well, quite frankly, Sophie, my view is no, because that issue has been and gone. And we are still, as I've said, living with the disease. It's right that we all act in a responsible and conscientious way. We have guidance, and it's important that we follow that guidance. I think, if nothing else, throughout the last 13 weeks, I and my colleagues across government have made that point emphatically, because we do not want a second wave of this disease. The disease has been catastrophic. People have died, lives have been lost. We've seen the impact across society and across families. And I think that's an incredibly sobering thought, which is why, again, we urge the public not to go out in mass gatherings, not to participate, in big groups, but to follow the guidance. It's a sensible and responsible thing to do.
Now, as lockdown is eased, it's getting increasingly difficult to police. We've seen some confrontations with the police at protests, but also, of course, at street parties as well. John Apter of the Police Federation said the level of anger, hatred and violence being shown against police officers by some is disgraceful, and said that some people now see them as fair game. Are you expecting more social unrest this summer than usual, and are contingency plans in place to deal with it?
Well, I think, first of all, John Apter, who heads up the Police Federation, has made some very, very poignant points about the level of assaults and the violence that we have seen on our police officers. They are thoroughly unacceptable. And in the previous year, we saw over 30,000 assaults on police officers, which is why I'm committed and will be putting in measures in place to double the sentencing around assaults on emergency workers. But, Sophie, you've asked about protests. I mean, what we've seen with gatherings, mass gatherings and protests is unacceptable. And the violence that we've seen against our officers is also unacceptable. Resources are in place, and I speak to the policing leadership near enough every single day. I speak to chief constables up and down the country. It's my duty and responsibility to make sure that they are well resourced and well equipped, in light of the fact that we have seen more gatherings, we've seen street parties, and we are seeing and have seen over recent weeks more protests. My message is the same. I would urge people not to participate in gatherings of that nature or protest, but also I would also add to that, if people do assault police officers, they will feel the full force of the law. And that is absolutely the right approach that the police will take. They will enforce the law. And it is simply unacceptable to have people gathering in some of these awful ways that we've been seeing. OK, now, I'm keen to ask you about another story that's been on the front of lots of newspapers this week, been covering it a lot on Sky News as well. Robert Jenrick, the Housing Secretary, under pressure to quit his job or to be sacked because of his role approving a controversial housing project that was pushed forward by the Conservative Party donor, Richard Desmond. He met him at a fundraising dinner that you were also at. Can you guarantee that Boris Johnson hasn't had any conversations with Richard Desmond, whether in person, over the phone or on text or email, about this housing development? Well, I think, Sophie, with regards to this particular development, this scheme that you're referring to, all the correspondence and all the documentation is out in the public domain. The Secretary of State for MHCLG, Robert Jenrick, has been very clear about that. He's answered questions in Parliament. He's put the correspondence in the public domain. He's written to the Select Committee about the decisions and the correspondence and the communications over this issue. And the Prime Minister himself says that the matter is closed. The transparency that has been required around this particular planning application has been, it's been adhered to. Documentation is in the public domain. That's right, and the Secretary of State has followed the rules and the guidance on that.
Although he published it because he was forced to. The question was also about the conversations, if any has happened, between the Prime Minister and Richard Desmond, because some people may be wondering that the real reason that Robert Jenrick is in his job is because he's acting as a firewall for Boris Johnson.
Well, I think, it's wrong to conflate political contacts and decision-making with a planning application right now. The Secretary of State has followed the process and he's put all the correspondence in the public domain. And, of course, there are very clear processes when it comes to planning applications, as all members of Parliament themselves will be aware of, in terms of the processes around decision-making, but also with local authorities as well. So I just don't see that there's anything to add to this particular story or this issue. Processes have been followed, documentation's in the public domain, transparency has been followed, and the matter is closed.
So can you guarantee that there hasn't been any contact between Boris Johnson and Richard Desmond with regards to this application?
Sophie, as I've said, with regards to this application, all the communication and the correspondence around it is in the public domain, and you'll be able to see, along with other members of the public, who's been involved in writing letters, corresponding, messaging, or even having telephone conversations on this particular issue. I'm not part of that.
OK, now a couple of things just to end on. Firstly, there's reports that Sir Mark Sedwill, the head of the civil service, could be removed from his post as early as this week. We've been expecting, of course, this number 10 to try and overhaul the civil service for some time now. Do you think that it's a good idea to have some fresh thinking in the role, perhaps an outsider?
Well, look, I mean, reform of the civil service is, a matter that gets discussed in government, and obviously a big role like that is subject to the Prime Minister. But I think the fact of the matter is right now, this government is focused on getting on and doing its job, delivering for the country, levelling up in the way in which we spoke about earlier on the economic agenda, focusing on social justice. This is the people's government delivering on the people's priorities, and effectively any reforming government will be based around the type of delivery that our Prime Minister wants to drive for our great country, and obviously have the right kind of support around him to deliver that.
OK, now there's just one final question that I am quite keen to ask you about while we have you. Because more than 30 Labour MPs from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds wrote to you recently after you spoke in the House of Commons in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests, talking about your own experience of racism. And in the letter they said that they were disappointed at the way you used your heritage and experiences of racism to gaslight the very real racism faced by Black people and communities across the UK. Do you think that some people have a particular problem with you as a BAME woman who is a Conservative?
Well, I think clearly in the case of those Labour MPs, they simply do, primarily because they clearly take the stance and the position that I just don't conform to their preconceived idea or stereotypical view of what an ethnic minority woman should stand for and represent. And in my view, Sophie, that in itself is racist. So it's very disappointing. And, I've made it quite clear I'm not going to dignify that letter any further.